the Crusades is a topic that is obviously important to us and still has an ongoing impact on our culture. So we're going to give this some attention today. As we begin, I want to point out that Leah Fraser has provided a very attractive travelogue of the Crusader castles in Israel, and I uploaded that to our discussion board today, so it's accessible to everyone. So I hope that you'll look at that. This was an assignment that I created, and I'm grateful for Leah's work on it, because the Crusader castles themselves are very interesting to me, and in fact, in November, I have a great opportunity to travel to Israel, and it will be my fifth pilgrimage with New Orleans Seminary, but this one will be a little different because Clay Corbin is going to make arrangements and allow me to travel on some some kind of personal day trips to visit several of these Crusader castles that still are in existence in Israel. This is a way that the church history intersects with the Holy Land, and I'm looking forward to taking pictures and some video and even delivering some lecture. I hope that there will be guides from the Israel Nature and Parks Authority who will be there to teach me about these different Crusader castles. And when it's all done, my hope and my goal is to put it all together to create a special upper-level course on the Crusades. So you might look for that, not this next year, which is my sabbatical year, but sometime after that. So anyway, the Crusader castles are very interesting to me, and again, you can get a view of this through Leah's work. While you're on the discussion board, be sure and look and see what other topics are available from your classmates. All right, the Medieval Crusades are, in a sense, the answer from the West to the idea of jihad or holy war instigated by the Muslims. So the Crusades are, in a sense, a holy war called by the Pope, carried on by Western kings to rid Christian society and the Catholic Church of religious enemies. It's defined rather broadly this way because the Crusades include not only the wars in the Holy Land, but also wars that took place in Europe against the Pope's political enemies or against those that the Church deemed to be heretics. We probably won't talk about that aspect of the Crusades so much today, but we will in future lectures. Many times I prefer to refer to those participants in the Crusades as Crusaders rather than as Christians, okay? Because even though there were religious motives for those who headed east, there also were political, military, and material motivations, so that they were they didn't all go for religious reasons, and it wasn't always strictly a religious and certainly not a Christian endeavor. So these are Crusaders. I say here that there were 8 major crusades from 1096 to 1291. There may have been as many as 10, including the Children's Crusade and counting the Crusades in Europe. But for the most part, historians look at 8 crusades from these years 1096 to 1291. And I need to say at the outset that we need not think of these crusades as being so carefully delineated. All right, there was really a crusading impulse that carried through all of these 200 years. But it's just there were waves of and emphases of the Crusades that enable us to number them 1 through 8. But even in between these crusades, there was always a crusading spirit. There were always these crusading conflicts in the East. So, about 200 years of these crusades. Now, what were the motivations for the crusades? We need to look for the reasons behind the crusades. Often, historians, especially today, in the aftermath of 9/11, and in an attempt to, let's say, mitigate the sentiment against Muslims following the terrorism of 9/11 and other attacks. There are those in the media and even some in who are historians who want to place all of the blame on the Westerners for the Crusades. In other words, they see this as Christian aggression against the Muslims in the East. This is, as most simplistic views of history, this is incorrect. All right? This was certainly not a one-sided event. All right? It wasn't completely the fault of the East, nor was it completely the fault of the West. But let's look and see what was going on in the years immediately preceding the Crusades. Well, when the year 1000 arrived, there were heightened expectations of the return of Christ. This was, after all, the millennium. Okay? So there was an expectation that Christ would return. Well, he didn't. And so that kind of led many Christians in the West to desire to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So pilgrims began to travel more and more to the Holy Land. Now, for a number of reasons. Number one is that for centuries, the idea of a pilgrimage had meant extra merit for those who participate in the pilgrimage. In other words, if you go on a pilgrimage, if you visit certain relics, or if you visit places where martyrs died, or places that were sacred for one reason or another, perhaps a special event in the history of the church or even the history of Israel. If you went to those places, you would acquire merit that would reduce the number of years that you spend in purgatory. Okay? We've talked about purgatory, we've talked about merit. This is a means of acquiring merit. And so this idea heightened after the year 1000. Then when Hungary was converted around that same time, that opened a land route, making it more possible for Christians to travel from the West to the East. However, Muslims, seeing these Christian pilgrims, began to harass them, to rob them, even to kill them. Okay, and so they began to attack these Christian pilgrims, and in response to the coming of the pilgrims and seeing how much these special places meant to them, they began to destroy the Christian shrines. All right. Therefore, the Crusades were fueled by the desire to reclaim the Holy Land. The Muslims are attempting to block access to the Holy Land. They're attempting to destroy those shrines in the Holy Land. Therefore, the Crusades were fueled by the desire to reclaim the Holy Land, and then, of course, the hatred of the Muslims that was inflamed by their actions. So the Crusades became an imitation of Muslim holy war, taking the language from the Quran, taking the language from the Muslims' own vocabulary. They began to say that to war against the Muslims, to war on behalf of the Holy Land itself was a holy war. Well, there's some political motivations as well. The Byzantine Empire, of course, remember that the Roman Empire had long been separated between the East and the West. The West had been weakened by the invasion of the barbarians. That political vacuum had been filled by the Bishop of Rome, now known as the Pope. And of course, by now, the Holy Roman Empire has provided a centralized political, military entity. But nonetheless, we still have the Eastern Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, in the East. They had become weaker and weaker because they were continually having to defend themselves against the attacks of Islam. All right, when we talk about the rise of Islam, we talk about how Islam had swept north and had conquered the Holy Land, had conquered Asia Minor. They were knocking on the door of Constantinople. So the empire was weak, leaving the West vulnerable to Muslim invasion. You remember also that the Muslims had swept across northern Africa and had crossed over into Spain, and they were threatening from the west. Now they're threatening from the east. But the Western armies had had victories in Italy and in Spain, especially in Spain when they had what we call the Reconquest, this reconquering of Spain, taking it back from the Muslims. That gave them the idea that we've conquered them in the West, now we can move against them in the East. The Normans were a particularly powerful and well-established group in the West. They originated as Norsemen. Remember, we talked about them. They came from the north, but they established themselves in Europe, especially in France and Italy. And so they desired to drive the Muslims from the Western Mediterranean, from their territory, and so they could expand their territory into the Orient, into the East. Their idea was trade, commerce. They recognized that there were commodities in the East that they could make them wealthy in the West, but they would have to conquer the Muslims who dominated the Arabian Peninsula. And in the West, feudalism and famine had suppressed people. Remember feudalism that forced the serfs to stay in the land, serving the lords. Well, this added with famine brought about this oppression, and so many of them were eager for wealth and adventure. The idea that if they traveled to the East on these crusades, they would have adventure for one, they'd have a chance to get off the land, and then even have an opportunity to make a new life for themselves. And then finally, we have encouragement from the Pope, Pope Urban II. We mentioned him last week. He was the last of the popes that were part of the Gregorian Reform, so he was a reform-minded pope. And you also will remember that under Leo IX, we had the separation of the church from the West and the East. This is the Great Schism, when Cardinal Humbert laid that bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. So from 1054 until now, for 40 years, there's been a separation. And so when the emperor in the East, the emperor in Constantinople, sent to the Pope asking for help. The Pope hoped that if they came to their assistance, there might be a reunion of the church between Eastern and Western Christianity. And so the Pope valued the Crusades so much that he offered what we call plenary indulgences to any Crusaders. All right? What is an indulgence? An indulgence is the opportunity for an individual to purchase, and well, let me back up. It is an opportunity for the Pope to offer forgiveness to a parishioner. All right? So the Pope felt that as the representative of Peter, he had the keys to heaven. He had the keys to that treasury of merit. He could unlock that treasury and give merit to those who apply for it. Okay? But the idea was that in order to apply for it, you had to provide to the Pope something that the Pope felt earned that merit. All right. So in this case, it was the commitment to a crusade. What does crusade mean? What's the root of crusade? The cross. All right. So anyone who went on a crusade was taking up the cross. So to take up the cross and go to and to go attempt to free the Holy Land was an act of Christian devotion, and as a result, the Pope offered a plenary indulgence, offered an indulgence for full remission of sins. And that was if you die. If you die on the crusade, you'll receive a full remission of sins. You won't have to go through purgatory. You'll go straight to heaven. So this was a spiritual reward that the Pope offered to each of the Crusaders. Now, it's just as a kind of a side note, later on, as the Crusades developed, there were those who could not go on a crusade, but who wanted to receive the indulgence. Therefore, they would be willing to pay the price for someone to go in their place. So we go from going on a crusade to paying for a crusade in order to receive an indulgence. And so it's just another step from there to say that all that's required is to pay money to the church to receive an indulgence. And that's where we're going to find ourselves in another 400-500 years after this, when Martin Luther rises up against the abuse of the sale of indulgences. Okay? But this is essentially where it began, the idea of indulgences for going on crusades.
Dr. B, what was the name of the popes who encouraged it? What were the main ones?
Well, the Pope in 1095 was Urban II. And then, so we'll be, and in the next lecture, we'll be looking at some of the many popes we have in the 1100s and 1200s. But the next major pope is going to be Alexander III, and then Innocent III, and so on. So, but all of those popes during those 200 years or more are going to be responsible for sending people on crusades. So the Eastern Emperor asked help from Pope Urban II. The Turks were threatening the Byzantine Empire. Urban saw a chance to reunite Christendom. And so in 1095, he called the Council of Clairvaux. He promised full remission of penalties for anyone going to fight, full remission of sins with eternal reward to those dying in the cause, and he promised the protection of Peter, Paul, and the church for their sakes. In other words, if you leave on a crusade, the church will guarantee the protection of the estate that you're leaving back home. Remember how important land is at this time. That is the source of wealth and status and government in the West. So to leave your estate behind was very risky. As we're going to see, the Pope really couldn't fulfill that promise. That was a promise that he could not keep. James?
When you say urban saw a chance to reenact Christendom, is that in the sense that it's good that the church is united, or is that in the sense that this is urban's chance to take a step above Constantinople and to be in control of everything?
Yes.
Okay.
I think for the most part, I think he was seeing that it was grievous that the church had divided. And he wanted to see the church united. But certainly, if the Pope in the West sent out his army to save the East, obviously he's going to be exercising authority, and he will be claiming the rewards of that. And yes, he would, and the Pope, either Pope Urban or succeeding popes, would use that as a further argument for the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. So a good point. He was not only seeking a spiritual unity, but he was also seeking to exert his authority over the East. All right. So, convened the council, made his speech, presented the call, and the answer was Deus vult, God wills it. And so they responded, and they went out on the crusade. They went out to gather up their armies. Remember, again, we have the kings, their noblemen, their knights. This is a time when the nobility would call in the allegiance of those who owed them obedience. And so they would gather their army and head to the east. And they, you can see from this that their picture of this crusade was Christ in the lead. See Christ with a two-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Christ with his word. And the Crusaders were following him, and they had taken up the cross. This is why so many times you see the flags with the cross, the shields with the cross. Their raiment had a cross on it because they all considered themselves to be taking up the cross. So we have the First Crusade. There were actually at least two waves that left. If you in your textbook, when you have time, look at there's a map in the new edition. It's on page 347. I think in the old edition it's 295. But at any rate, there's a map that shows how we have these multiple prongs. Well, one prong was led by the common people. They didn't want to be left out, and they were not going to wait for the assembly of the kings and the knights. And so Peter the Hermit led one mob heading to Jerusalem. And this group was also included Walter the Penniless. And this is known as the People's Crusade. There were as many as 600,000 in the People's Crusade, but only 40,000 of them arrived in the Holy Land. Many of them died along the way, either of disease or starvation. Many were killed. Many deserted. So we have Peter the Hermit, Walter the Penniless, and as they went, they did not have enough food, and so they just pillaged the countryside. This is a way for them to feed themselves, was to go on the crusade and just as the power of numbers, they would just go into a village and pillage it. When they came across a Jewish settlement, they thought, we're going to defend the Holy Land. Here are a group of Jews, and they just decided that they would slaughter them along the way, and felt like that also was part of their crusade. As I say, many of them died from plague and famine. In one battle in western Turkey, there were 17,000 killed. So that was an unfortunate aspect of the First Crusade. Well, the formal crusade, consisting of the nobility and their knights, they arrived at Constantinople. They allied themselves with the Byzantine army, and they captured Nicaea easily. You'll remember that Nicaea was the setting of the first council. It is in what we call Turkey today. And then next they went to Antioch of Syria, and they captured it after a long siege. But once they were inside the fortress, they got news that a Muslim army was approaching Antioch, and so and they were going to be outnumbered, and so they were fearful of the attack and the siege by the Muslims that was coming. Well, Peter Bartholomew, one of the holy men, claimed that he received a vision from St. Andrew that revealed that the Holy Lance was buried inside the fortress at Antioch. Now, what do you think this Holy Lance might have been?
Spear that Jerry used to pierce Christ.
That's right. The soldier that pierced Christ's side at the end when blood and water came out, that soldier is in legend is named Longinus, and Longinus is now a saint. And there's a statue of Longinus in St. Peter's Basilica, in one of the four corners around the canopy, and it is said that there are actually relics from Longinus is buried in that place. All right. Now, the story goes that they began digging for it, and after a long time they didn't find it. But all of a sudden, Peter Bartholomew jumped into the trench, and lo and behold, he found the lance. Whether he found it or whether he jumped in with it is not known. But nonetheless, he revealed the lance, and when it was recovered, the Crusaders rallied against the larger Muslim army and successfully defended Antioch. Now, this spear of Longinus is known as James said, the spear of destiny, the Heilige, or the Holy Lance. And it's one of the most important and legendary relics of Christ's Passion. The spear supposedly passed through a multitude of hands. And after this event, Frederick of Barbarossa, as we're going to see in a later crusade, ended up with it. And then after he lost it, Frederick was drowned in the river. Okay? So the legend arose that whoever claimed the spear holds the destiny of the world in his hands for good or evil. Now, in the 20th century, what world leader became obsessed with religious artifacts? Hitler. All right. Of course, Raiders of the Lost Ark was on one more time this on TV this weekend, and of course that was his obsession with the Ark of the Covenant. Well, he was also obsessed with the Spear of Destiny, and supposedly a remnant of the spear was in the Habsburg Museum in Vienna, Austria. In 1938, Hitler ordered the SS to seize the spear. These were taken by train to Nuremberg. They were stored there. Then moved to a specially constructed vault secret, intended to protect it. But when Nuremberg was captured by the Allied troops in April of 1945, the spear was confiscated by American forces on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, less than 2 hours before Hitler's suicide. All right. So, like the spear's previous owners, Hitler perished after the relic was taken from him. And today, this remnant of the Holy Spear, the Spear of Destiny, has been returned to the Hofburg Museum in Vienna. All right. I suppose it can be seen there today. I've not been to Vienna, but there it is, the Spear of Destiny. All this to say that this story goes all the way back to the Crusades, and it had importance even in the 20th century. Dwayne, yeah. If you're going to ask a question, do more than your finger.
And so the understanding, the idea of the Crusades wasn't just against Muslims; it was against anyone who wasn't. You said, if I get it correct, they first attacked the Jews, right?
Well, the Jews were just kind of along the way, and so no, I think I would say that the Crusades were, for the most part, an effort to regain the Holy Land. All right, and so I would say that the Muslims were the primary target of the Crusades. Along the way, these misguided peasants, as part of the People's Crusade, they took advantage of the Jews along the way. I think that they treated them probably no differently than they did others whose villages they pillaged for gain. It was just that because they were Jews, they could use a kind of a religious motive for their destruction of the village, but they destroyed Christian villages as well. Okay? All right. Now, June 12th, 1099, the Crusaders siege Jerusalem for the first time. And all of a sudden, they're confronted by this hermit, and he prophesies, "Attack tomorrow, and the Lord will deliver it to you." Now, there was quite a bit of debate over whether they should attack immediately, because they really were not prepared to attack this walled, well-defended city. But spurred on by this prophecy, they went ahead and made the attempt, but they had too few ladders. They could not scale the walls, and so they were rebuffed, and so they withdrew. There was a long siege of Jerusalem because of its strong defenses. The Muslims inside were supplied with food and water. The Crusaders had little water. The Crusaders needed siege equipment, towers and ladders and catapults, and they didn't have materials. And so they had to transport water and wood over long distances, and of course, as they were traveling, they were exposed to raids by Muslims who also could easily pick off and kill those trying to transport these supplies. Finally, a supply ship arrived in Jaffa, which now is Tel Aviv, that port city, and so that brought some needed help. But in the meantime, the Crusaders were feuding with each other. Remember, these were nobles who were accustomed to fighting each other for land, so they were fighting here. Many of them deserted. They suffered. Many of them died, and so it did not look good for the Crusaders. But another vision came along. This time, a priest reported a vision of the dead Ottomar, who he was one of the bishops who had died early in the Crusade, and out of death, from the life beyond the grave, Ottomar spoke to the priest and said, that the Crusaders should purge your sins, march barefoot around Jerusalem, fast, and then attack on the 9th day. Well, the Crusaders indeed did march barefoot. They ended up on Mount Olivet, and the feuding princes embraced and set aside their differences. And so united, they were able to build the siege equipment, prepare the weapons, and the battle began on July the 13th, about 1 month after they had arrived. They fought for 2 days. The weary Crusaders considered withdrawal, but then they saw on Mount Olivet a knight waving his shield. They never did discover who this knight was. Perhaps this was a vision of Christ himself rallying the troops, okay? Whoever it was and whatever it was that they saw, they renewed their efforts and attacked again. Finally, burning arrows managed to catch some wood in the wall, managed to catch it on fire, and as it burned, then they were able to move their siege towers forward to the wall, and they climbed and could get the bridge to the wall to enter the city. Once they entered the city, they were able to open the gates, and then there was nothing to bar the way of the Crusaders entering. The governor of Jerusalem surrendered. Jerusalem was sacked. Muslims were slaughtered. The stories that are told of the slaughter are very gruesome, considering the blood that was shed. All right, as a result, Godfrey of Bouillon was named the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. He would not take on the name King of Jerusalem. Instead, he was the protector of the Holy Sepulchre. After he died, his brother Baldwin, who took over rule, did take the title King of Jerusalem. But anyway, this was the end of the First Crusade, and it ended somewhat in success. Now, here we have a very stylized, idealized image of the end of the Crusade. Obviously, they did not find the cross there, long destroyed and sent in splinters throughout Europe as relics. But nonetheless, this image shows that they had arrived in Jerusalem. They felt like they had been successful. They had seized much of the Holy Land and certainly had recaptured the holy city, Jerusalem. Okay? Any questions or comments? All right. I regret that Jinhee Lee is not with us today. He did his paper on the First Crusade, and he perhaps could have added to our understanding of the First Crusade, but nonetheless his paper is available to you to look at. All right. So this was 1099. We have the capture of Jerusalem and many parts of Israel. Now it's sad but true that these knights in Israel set up their own kingdoms, and then they began to do in the east as they had done in the west to fight against each other. And in fact, the Western Knights would even ally themselves with Muslims in order to fight against their Western brothers. So we have a weakness in Israel among the Westerners because of their fighting against each other. So in 1144, the Muslims were able to capture Edessa, one of the major cities in the area. So back in the West, we have Bernard of Clairvaux. Remember, he was one of the leading monks of what monastic movement? No, Benedict was the very first monastic movement. And then there were the Cluniac Reform, and then the Cistercian. Thank you, Adrian. The Cistercians, all right? That may be on the test, all right? So remember the name of the Cistercians, and Bernard of Clairvaux was one of the leading figures of the 12th century. And you remember when we discussed him last week, I said that one of his major contributions to that era was preaching for the Second Crusade, saying that the Knights needed to return to take back Edessa. So, 1147, German and French armies marched to the Holy Land. However, this time they were defeated at Edessa, Laodicea, Damascus. The Second Crusade ended in disgrace. So when they came back, Bernard had to find a new theme for his preaching, okay? And that was that God was judging the church for its apathy, for its immorality, for its lack of faith, for its sin. And so he preached judgment on the sinful people. All right, after they had, yes, Chase?
Do you know what the big difference was? I mean, it seems like they were doing well, and then all of a sudden they lost every battle after that. What was the difference?
Well, I don't know that I can say with confidence. I would expect what I just said, that they were too busy fighting each other to be united in their cause. Second, those motivations that drove them at the beginning became less clear or less compelling. And it may be also that the Muslims at the beginning were ill-prepared for the coming of the West, and later on they were able to unite in their defense of their country, of what they considered to be their country. I do know that from this point forward, at least for the next several decades, the one reason for the success of the Muslims is Saladin, who was a great Muslim general that is going to take a very prominent role in the next stage.
You know, that they were briefly in charge for a while. How did the Eastern Church react to the Western Church? Did they appreciate it, or are you going to talk about it later on?
Well, I will. Let me just say right now that the Eastern Emperor was very concerned when this Western army showed up, and he was very eager to send them on their way because he feared the power of the Western army, and for good reason. We will see, in the future that the Western army took advantage of the Eastern well. So the Eastern Emperor was very concerned about the presence of these Westerners in his kingdom, and rightfully so. All right. Well, in 1187, Saladin captured Jerusalem. All right, and this just sent shockwaves through the West. Now, the story of Saladin and his capture of Jerusalem is the background to the story told in the movie Kingdom of Heaven. All right, with Orlando Bloom. How many of y'all have seen that movie? All right, it is full of historical inaccuracies, woeful inaccuracies. One of the first semesters that I taught as an adjunct was teaching history of Christianity. You know, I like the movie reviews. This was one of the movies that I assigned, mainly because it was the only modern movie that really told the story of the Crusade. I got some pushback from one of my very conservative students that I was assigning an R-rated movie, and so I had to give some options to this movie, and then I decided that really, it was so inaccurate, it really was almost worthless. So I pulled it off the list entirely, and those, my online class, right, you know, I guess today they are submitting a movie review of Beckett. Okay, we'll talk about Beckett later this afternoon. But at any rate, Kingdom of Heaven does tell the story, does tell a version of the story of how Saladin captured Jerusalem in spite of the efforts of Orlando Bloom, Balian of Ibelin, to protect it. There actually was a character named Balian. He was indeed a noble of the kingdom of Ibelin in Israel, but he didn't originate as a French blacksmith. Instead, he was raised in Israel by his father, and he never had any kind of romantic relationship with Sybil. Instead, she was a very powerful queen of Guy de Lusignan and was part of all of the machinations that he had. So anyway, all this to say that the characters in the movie have their counterparts in reality, but the lives that they show are completely fictionalized. But it is a movie that does communicate the spirit of the Crusades. I will say this, that as you see the Crusaders gathered and they say, Deus vult, God wills it, that is their attitude as they fight against the Muslims. And it is accurate that in the battle of the Horns of Hattin, which is where the Knights Templar are totally defeated. It is true that Guy de Lusignan did lead the army in a stupid advance into the desert with no water. And so it's very easy for the Muslims to defeat them there because they were very poorly prepared for that battle. All right. And the other thing that the movie communicates to us is that all of these activities were taking place in between the Second and Third Crusade, which show that it's not like the Crusade ended at one time and they didn't end in 1147 and began again in 1187. No, in those 4 decades in between what we call the Second and Third Crusades, there still was much crusading, fighting, negotiating going on in the East. All right, but when Saladin captured Jerusalem, sent shockwaves through the West, and we had the beginning of the Third Crusade. Now, this is called the Crusade of the Three Kings. We had Frederick I, also known as Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa meaning the red beard. All right. It's too bad Matthew Stevens is not with us today. He could be our Barbarossa. I don't know. Garrett has a beard. It's not quite. Not quite red enough. But anyway, Barbarossa of Germany was one of the kings. Philip II, Philip Augustus of France, was another king, and then Richard the Lionheart, very well known, was the third king involved in this Third Crusade. Now, they went to the east. Frederick and his army had great success against the Muslims at Iconium, but then the idiot tried to swim across the river in his armor, and you know what? That didn't work. So he sank like a rock and drowned. All right. So after that, the Germans pretty much left. Philip of France participated in the victorious siege of Acre, but then he departed for France because he hoped to take Normandy back from England while Richard was on the crusade. So much for Urban's promise of the protection of Peter, Paul, and the church on the estates. Okay, so Philip left. So Richard is the only one remaining. He could not win Jerusalem, but he fought Saladin to a standstill and therefore was able to negotiate a treaty with Saladin to allow Christian pilgrimages. So here we have the Third Crusade. It has some successes, but nothing major, and certainly not their ultimate goal of regaining Jerusalem. Okay. All right. 1192, Richard sailed for England. He was shipwrecked in Austria. He was kidnapped by Duke Leopold, and it was during this time that his brother John tried to take over England in the absence of his brother. When Richard returned, he settled affairs with John. He began a war against Philip, but Richard died in battle. He died from just a random arrow shot in the air. Managed to find Richard and kill him. If you have seen the Russell Crowe version of Robin Hood, that's exactly what happened to King Richard, was that he died by a random arrow. Well, a lot of movies made about this period of time. Certainly Robin Hood and Ivanhoe are two stories that were developed that later made into movies. The early ones are the best. Okay? If you haven't seen The Adventures of Robin Hood in glorious Technicolor, you need to get that by Netflix or watch Turner Classic Movies. They show it all the time. Where else are you going to see Robin Hood in green sequins or Little John in yellow tights? Okay. But it really is a great story. I do like the Kevin Costner version as well, and Russell Crowe, that version is so-so. There's just a number of Robin Hood stories. Ivanhoe, we have Robert Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor, Joan Fontaine. You can enjoy that for Elizabeth Taylor alone. All right. So again, those are some good movies. They kind of give you kind of what's going on back in England during the time that Richard is off at the Crusades and then trying to return to England. But it also gives you a good picture, as I said last week, of feudalism, because you see Prince John negotiating with King Richard's nobles, vassals, trying to gain power. All right. Well, moving along. The Fourth Crusade was, if possible, the biggest disaster of them all. Innocent III, we'll talk about him if we hurry. Innocent III initiated this crusade in the early 1200s. And his goal was to send the Crusaders to Egypt, hoping that in Egypt they would defeat the Muslim army there that was supplying the army in Jerusalem. Well, the Crusaders needed transportation, and so they went to merchants to rent their ships. Well, the merchants, for payment, wanted the Crusaders to help them gain trade routes in the east. So the Crusaders ended up being sidetracked by these merchant ship owners into sacking Constantinople. And so these Crusaders, instead of going to Egypt, instead of going to Israel, they went to Constantinople, where the Eastern Christians were in control, and they literally sacked the city, pillaging the city, stealing their wealth, and claiming it for their own, essentially defeating Constantinople. Now, Innocent III was furious that the Crusaders had done this against his orders, but when they pointed out to him that now there's a Latin kingdom in the East that united the East and the West, not by spiritual means, but by force, then he was mollified temporarily. 1261, it was recovered by the Byzantines, and so at that point, the schism between the East and the West was even deeper than it was before. So the Fourth Crusade is probably the most shameful of all of them. All right, in 1212, we have what's known as the Children's Crusade. There were a group of children, one group led by Stephen, one group led by Nicholas, and they had the idea that the Crusaders had failed because they were not pure enough, because they were older and had accumulated more sins, that those who could actually successfully complete a crusade were those who were young and therefore pure. And so 7,000 French children aged 12 to 18 dreamed that they could accomplish what armed men could not, that is the recapture of Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre. They walked to the Mediterranean Sea, and they were disappointed when God did not part the sea so they could march to Jerusalem. So most of them died of starvation and exposure, or when ships came to pick them up, they thought they would carry them on to the Holy Land, but instead they just took them into slavery. And so they were sold and never heard from again. All right, so that is the Children's Crusade. Two other later crusades that I'll just mention briefly are the 7th and 8th Crusades. And you see the dates there. These are interesting to us who live in New Orleans because they were led by the King of France, Louis IX. And he is the only monarch who later was named a saint. So that's why we have St. Louis. Right? Much is named after St. Louis, a city here in the United States. The cathedral in the French Quarter is St. Louis Cathedral. That's named for him. And inside that cathedral, how many of y'all have been inside? Okay. Oh, a goodly number of you. It's beautiful on the inside. The apse is decorated by a mural of Louis setting out on the crusade, and then the stained glass windows tell the story of his life, ending up with his dying in Israel of the plague, but he also had healed people along the way, so that's why he is a saint. You know, in 1291, the Crusader city of Acre fell. Acre being a port city. Acre, after Jerusalem fell, the Crusaders set up their headquarters in Acre. Now it's called Akko, but that became a very wealthy port city. In fact, it is said that the income of Acre was greater than the income of the King of France. So it's a great, wealthy city. But that was it fell in 1291, and so then the Christian presence in the Holy Land ended at 1291. Now, there were Crusader outposts in Cyprus. There still were further attempts by Crusaders to retake the Holy Land, but usually we point to 1291 as a major end to the Crusades, because there's no more presence, and after that there's really no success to speak of. All right. Any questions or comments about the Crusades? Let's talk about the results. The Crusades continued through the 13th century. New monastic orders were developed as a result of the Crusades, and they are interesting to us. First of all, we have the Knights Hospitallers. They were developed in 1092. The full name was the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, and originally they were tasked to care for the pilgrims and the sick people in the Holy Land. And then it became a military monastic order, and those members were knighted. The other group is better known, and that's the Knights Templar. Their full name is the Poor Knights of Christ of the Temple of Solomon. Named this because when they entered the Temple Mount, they discovered the Dome of the Rock and the El Aqsa Mosque, and they felt like the El Aqsa Mosque was actually the remains of the Temple of Solomon, and so they felt that they discovered the temple, and so they were called the Knights of the Temple, or the Knights Templar. Now their goal was to protect Christians on pilgrimages, but later they developed into a military force. And again, when you see the Kingdom of Heaven, or when you read about the Horns of the Hattin, that army was composed of the Knights Templar. And until Hattin, they had always been successful in their military endeavors. Once they failed there, however, they shifted their emphasis, and they became some of the first bankers. Now, how did this work? All right, I've already talked about how under feudalism, the economy was based on land. And yet we have these knights leaving their land behind and going to the east. So a knight would go to the bank of the Knights Templar and receive a letter of credit based upon his holdings. He would carry that letter of credit to the east, where he would give it over to the bank of the Knights Templar there, and he would receive the gold that he needed to live on. So you see the banking, of course, interest being charged on both ends. So the Knights Templar became very wealthy because of their foray into the banking industry. And their work in banking is going to have a big impact on life back in Europe following the Crusades. But at any rate, the Knights Templar they became wealthy bankers. They developed a fleet in which to carry their wealth back and forth. They also developed a trade, and they became so wealthy and powerful that they attracted the attention, the fear, and the greed of Philip IV of France. So in 1300, Philip IV sent out secret messages to all the outposts where Knights Templar were stationed, and he had the Knights Templar arrested on Friday, October the 13th, 1300, which is why Friday the 13th is considered an unlucky day. All right. He had Pope Clement V, who was under his control. Pope Clement V arrested all the Knights Templar in France, England, and Spain. In 1310, there were 15 Templars that were burned at the stake in Paris. 1312, the Council of Venice disbanded the Templars. And in 1314, which was the Jacques de Molay, was the last Templar Grand Master, and he was burned at the stake. The accusations for these men were that they performed witchcraft, sorcery, apostasy, idolatry. They even accused them of homosexuality. So, but none of these accusations have ever been proved true. It seems that the only motivation for these arrests and for the executions of the Templars and the destruction of their order was the greed of King Philip IV. But did Philip IV discover and appropriate all the wealth of the Knights Templar? Well, of course, if you've seen National Treasure, you know that treasure is buried in, where was it? New York or Boston or New York? All right. But anyway, the Knights Templar are the subject of films, the National Treasure, Da Vinci Code, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and supposedly the Freemasons are a continuation of this society. So there you go. The legends of the Knights Templar still continue. Well, the power and wealth of the papacy increased following the Crusades. There was an increased interest in relics. As people came back from the Holy Land, they would bring back supposed relics. If you've seen the movie Luther, you'll remember his line that there were enough nails from the cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. Okay, so there was this great trade in relics coming back from the Holy Land, and at home the crusading zeal turned toward fighting heresy. Well, other results were the mistrust and enmity that developed between the East and the West, between Muslim and Christian, increased contact with the Byzantine East and the Islamic civilization, which brought about a recovery of Aristotle and the rise of scholarship. We'll talk about this when we get to the topic of scholasticism. And then we have the rise of the city-states in Italy. So after the Crusades, it became possible for a person to have wealth outside of owning land. We have the banking industry developing. We have trade and commerce developing. And so these other sources of wealth begin to undermine feudalism, so that not only do we have other sources, but even better sources of wealth. Okay. So, that concludes our discussion of the Crusades, unless you have any questions.